Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you, as always, from the sweltering hot climes of Western Japan here in July of 2024 with another edition of Questions for Corbett, that regular D program where you send in the questions and I provide some answers. And this week we're going to tackle a question about the World War I conspiracy. You know, my documentary about the World War I conspiracy that I released back towards the latter half of 2018. You will remember it well, I hope. If not, you can refresh your memory or encounter it for the first time, for free, of course, at CorbettReport.com/WWI, where you can get the audio and video and the transcript, the sources, everything there. Of course, available at CorbettReport.com/WWI. And on that note, I should point out that I got yet another email recently. James, where are your documentaries? Why are you hiding your documentaries on this newfangled website you have? Please just scroll down. Just scroll down a little bit on the front page. And there are the documentaries, all in a beautiful rotating display with the full color posters that brought it up. Looks gorgeous. It's wonderful. It works. You can click on them to go to the World War I conspiracy or any of my other documentaries. Please, people, please learn how to use a website. Anyway, let's get into the mailbag for a question about the World War I conspiracy. This email coming in from Corbett Report member OpenLens, who wrote, I have a question today regarding the World War I conspiracy. This is what I'm wondering. Was this UK wants to disempower Germany idea really about two competing houses of German royalty? At the time, the UK royalty was German, was it not? The name change to House of Windsor did not occur until 1917. Kaiser Wilhelm II was King of Germany. George V was King of England during World War I. They were both grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Edward VII was her son, the previous king. July 17th, 1917, British Royal House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha becomes the House of Windsor, a name change from longtime German ancestry by royal proclamation from King George V. Interestingly enough, when Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates, he immigrates to Holland, where he lives until he dies. So when I mentioned all this in passing to someone months ago, they said something about the House of Hanover? So I've got some research to do. Any help? All right. Well, thank you for the question, OpenLens. And yes, okay, I have some thoughts and some answers. But first things first, let's tackle the first order question here. The British royal family, were they German? Oh, you must be mistaken. The British royal family? You know, the British royal family. Oh, we are not amused. That British royal family, the growing human population. That British royal family? Shine your shoes for a shilling, Governor. That British royal family? No, they're as British as they come. I mean, just listen to King Charles delivering a speech in his native language.
Es ist wunderbar, heute Abend in so großer Gesellschaft zu sein. Und es ist schön von Ihnen, dass Sie gekommen sind und mich nicht mit einem Dinner for One alleine lassen.
Oh, jolly good jest there, King Charles, or should I say König Charles. Yes, not only does he sprechen Sie his Deutsche very wunderbar, but he also manages to make jokes based on cultural references that are literally only understandable by Germans in Germany. Newsflash, the English have no idea what dinner for one is anymore, but the Germans do. The only way you can make that German joke spoken by a German speaker in front of all those Germans any more German is to somehow add David Hasselhoff to that mix. But you get the idea. Yes, the British royal family, the House of Windsor, has some interesting Germanic roots to it, a Germanic strain, if you will, that goes much deeper than simply the fact that the King of England can speak German. There is more to it than that, and that was something that did not go unnoticed by the British public back during World War I, when the English were looking around saying, hey, wait, we're supposed to absolutely hate those horrible Huns over there, but we're being ruled by a bunch of Germans with Germanic titles. What's going on here? It became a bit of a PR problem for the royal household there in England. So what did they do about that? Well, as OpenLens correctly points out, there was a royal proclamation to take care of that PR disaster. And if you want more on that, you can go to this article on July 17th, 1917, The Birth of the House of Windsor, which has this crazy story. So it notes that the anti-German feeling in the United Kingdom existed even before World War I. In 1912, 2 years before the start of the First World War, Prince Louis of Battenberg, Admiral in the Royal Navy, had been appointed First Sea Lord, the professional head of the United Kingdom's Royal Navy. Some members of the British press were against Prince Louis's appointment because he was a German. Prince Louis was born Count Ludwig Alexander of Battenberg. Doesn't get more English than that, huh? Influenced by his cousin's wife, Princess Alice, a daughter of Queen Victoria, and by Prince Alfred, another of Queen Victoria's children, Prince Louis joined the British Royal Navy and became a naturalized British subject in 1868 at the age of 14. Side note, Louis and Victoria are the maternal grandparents of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. That's interesting. Let's follow that link a little bit later, shall we? But for now, let's get back to the story. However, in 1914, with war imminent, there was an intense anti-German sentiment in Britain. Louis, despite his exemplary 46-year career in the Royal Navy, was still seen by many as just a German prince. There were false accusations in the media of spying for the Germans. In fact, due to his German relations, he was able to learn much about the German military and shared that information with the British. He was spying against the Germans, not for them. Despite protests from King George V, Louis was asked to resign his position as First Sea Lord in October 1914. And who was he replaced by again? And what might that man's connections have been to, say, the previous King of England, Edward VII? Anyway, I'll let you look into that in your own time. But continuing with the story, by 1917, anti-German sentiment had reached a fevered pitch in the United Kingdom. The British royal family's dynastic name had gone from one German name to another, the House of Hanover, to the decidedly more Germanic-sounding House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Many British people felt this implied a pro-German bias. In May 1917, King George V discussed this matter with his private secretary Arthur Biggie Smalls, 1st Baron Stamfordham. Lord Stamfordham had to agree that Germanic names and titles were in several branches of the royal family and that no one was really certain what the royal family's surname was. The College of Arms, delegated to act on behalf of the crown in all matters of heraldry, the granting of new coats of arms, genealogical research, and the recording of pedigrees, was consulted as to what was King George V's surname. The answer was an uncertain one. We don't know. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was a geographic name. The surname was not Stuart and not Guelph, which had been the old family name of the Hanoverians. That name was lost by common law when Queen Victoria married. Looking into Prince Albert's family, there was Vipper and Vedden, but no one was absolutely certain of the answer. Anyway, just to show the royal family's predicament, here's a popular cartoon from 1917 called A Good Riddance, showing King George V sweeping away the German heraldry and all those titles and the Germanic strain in the royal family. Nothing to see here, folks. Anyway, PR 1917 style, huh? King George V decided that a name change was necessary to show that the royal family was indeed British. The king's uncle, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, suggested the name Tudor Stuart, but that name was discarded because of unpleasant implications. Other names suggested were Plantagenet, York, Lancaster, and even just plain England. You think that'll satisfy the rubes? We'll just call ourselves England. Case closed. Meetings began to take on the nature of a parlor game. Lord Stamfordham ultimately came up with an acceptable idea. King Edward III had been known as Edward of Windsor, after his birthplace, Windsor Castle. Windsor, which comes from the Old English Windlesor, or winch by the riverside, had been a settlement for hundreds of years before William the Conqueror had a castle built there in 1070. King George V agreed that Windsor would be the family name, and on July 17, 1917, the Privy Council gave final approval, and on the next day the following proclamation from King George V appeared in newspapers: "Whereas we, having taken into consideration the name and title of our royal house and family, have determined that henceforth our house and family shall be known and styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor." Yes, wonderful, amazing. Anyway, when Wilhelm II, German Emperor, a grandson of Queen Victoria and a first cousin of King George V, received the news, he smiled, got up from his chair, and said in his perfect English that he was off to the theatre to see Shakespeare's play, The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. King George V's relatives who had Germanic titles and were British subjects exchanged their old names and titles for new ones. I'll take that one, please. While the transition in names and titles was occurring, Prince Louis of Battenberg spent some time at the house of his eldest son, George. After his surname was anglicized from Badenburg to Mountbatten, and Louis became the Marquess of Milford Haven instead of Prince of Badenburg, he wrote in his son's guest book, "Arrived Prince Hyde, departed Lord Jekyll." Haha. Anyway, there's more information on the various names that were changed around there, but let's go back to that little side note from earlier. So, good old Louis of Badenburg, Ludwig Alexander Badenburg, Louis Mountbatten, and Victoria, his wife, were the maternal grandparents of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And if you follow that link, you will find this interesting little tidbit from the entry on Prince Philip. With, yes, that Prince Philip, by the way. The growing human population. No, from where we sit, there's nothing else, really. I'd like to be reincarnated as a virus to contribute to the problem of overpopulation. With Elizabeth's accession, it seemed probable that the royal house would become the House of Mountbatten, following the custom of a wife taking her husband's surname upon marriage. However, both Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Elizabeth's grandmother, Queen Mary, were in favor of keeping the House of Windsor. On April 19, 1952, Queen Elizabeth issued a declaration that Windsor would continue to be the name of the royal house. Prince Philip supposedly told some friends, "I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." In 1960, Queen Elizabeth modified the 1952 declaration by declaring that, "While I and my children will continue to be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor, my descendants, other than descendants enjoying the style, title, or attributes of Royal Highness, and the titular dignity of Prince or Princess, and female descendants who marry and their descendants shall bear the name Mountbatten Windsor." You following all of this? Does that mean Harry he's not a prince anymore? So is he now a Mountbatten? I don't know. Whatever. And if you want to confuse it even more, you'll notice how much Queen Victoria pops up in all of these genealogies, because she was the ancestor of everyone. If you go to the descendants of Queen Victoria, and you look into not only her 4 sons and 5 daughters, but 20 grandsons and 22 granddaughters, you'll find that not only were all of the main belligerents of the European royal families that were in World War I all cousins, all related to each other, British King George V, German Emperor Wilhelm II, the Russian Empress Alexandra, of course, married to Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, Swedish Crown Princess Margaret, Queen Maud of Norway, Queen Sophia of Greece, Queen Marie of Romania, and Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, just to name a few. So yes, there's a whole lot you can get into. And you can start drilling down on this, because I think we have to start understanding, yes, okay, there's these Germanic titles that come from all of these marriages between these European bloodlines, but I think we have to stop thinking about royalty in terms of nationality so much as royalty being its own special thing. They like to think of themselves as blue bloods, the upper crust, the elite. I like to think of them as degenerate inbreds who have weird congenital diseases because they inbreed with each other so much that they're on path towards inbreeding themselves out of existence like the Habsburgs did. Well, come on, guys, keep going. Keep marrying your cousins. But I think we have to start understanding that the royals are a family, and that transcends the nationality aspect of it. And you can start getting a handle on that from some mainstream sources. George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm is a book that I'm currently reading, and it does have some good information and some insight into the familial relations between these people, and who liked who and who hated who couldn't stand who. Everyone kind of hated Wilhelm. He did play that sort of Germanic stereotype, humorless person who didn't quite understand that others were making fun of him and what have you. And he was, so there was that family dynamic going on. But then you have to, of course, filter the mainstream out of a book like this one, where it notes, for example, talking about the press and how it treated these royal families. In Britain, it was different. The independent press had a much longer history, and literacy rates were high. By the 1890s, successful British papers had circulations much larger than their European counterparts, large enough not to need or want government subsidies, and possessed an intense self-consciousness about their importance as cornerstones of liberal democracy. So you see, the British press had all this freedom, and they went off script and started essentially taunting and making enemies of the Germans, when this wasn't what the Germanic British royal family wanted it all, honest. So Wilhelm took, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, took British press criticism of Germany personally and couldn't resist seeing his English relatives, especially his uncles, i.e. King Edward VII, the father of King George V, who was the king at the time of World War I, Edward VII, this should be resonating for people who really did dive into the World War I conspiracy, his hands in this anti-German sentiment in the British press, consistently overinflating the British royal family's influence. It was a sign, overinflating the British royal family's influence. It was a sign of how successfully the Queen had come to be seen as a disinterested force in British politics that in 1898, she managed to persuade the editors of the major papers to tone down their anti-German coverage. Even so, her intervention lasted only a few months. By 1900, the new tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mail, with the unheard-of circulation of 1 million copies a day, would be putting out a message that was unashamedly populist, emotive, aggressively imperialist, even xenophobic, and quite beyond the control of any government. Oh, yes. It would identify Germany as Britain's key enemy, well before the British government did. Salisbury, who loathed it despite its conservative affiliations, he called it the paper for those who could read but could not think, could see it spoke powerfully to and for a new strident and sometimes ugly strand of public opinion. Yes, yes. So the British establishment was totally at arm's removed. They couldn't do anything about the British press. Well, you get a different sense of that type of history in a real history book like Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War, which again should be familiar to people who did do their homework on the World War I conspiracy, of course by Jerry Docherty and Jim McGregor, which talk about, for example, the Daily Mail and its role in whipping up anti-German hysteria amongst the British population and what influences may have been at work there. They talk about the revolution in newspaper circulation with its popular daily papers, magazines, and pamphlets bypassed the Times in the first years of the 20th century, but did not alter its focus. The paper was, however, ailing and in danger of running at an unsustainable loss. Its savior, Alfred Harmsworth, was, on first consideration, an unlikely guardian of the secret elite's public voice. As leaders of the Yellow Press, a term of utter contempt derived from the sensationalist journalism developed in New York at the turn of the century, Harmsworth did not naturally belong inside the elite, but as his extensive stable proved, sensationalism sold newspapers, and they wielded immense influence. He brought up a very large section of the London-based press, including the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Graphic, Evening News, and Weekly Dispatch. If he was not from the natural constituencies that bred Britain's elite, he was close to them. Harmsworth had been very supportive of Alfred Milner during the Boer War, and his Daily Mail gave great prominence to Percy Fitzpatrick's The Transvaal from Within, which helped promote the need for war. Harmsworth was an innovator. He convinced Cecil Rhodes to give him an exclusive and entirely favorable interview, which he published throughout the civilized world. Harmsworth was ennobled by King Edward that same year, took the title of Lord Northcliffe, and was increasingly drawn into secret elite circles. This is an example of one of those people who come up, innovative, go-getter, sells papers, gets people talking, does new things, and is drawn into the circle, gets the pat on the back, gets the royal title, you're one of us now, and starts working towards their agenda. And they talk about this at greater length, talking about the types of articles and the things that Harmsworth Northcliffe would do, not only because it was good for business, selling newspapers, but also was in line with what the anti-German sentiment that the British establishment, the secret elite, as Docherty and McGregor talk about, wanted to foster at that time, talking about the invasion of 1910 and all of these other sensationalist things they did, where they literally got their newspaper salesmen to dress up in German uniforms as this imaginary invasion swept across England, and every day in the paper there'd be a new installment of this totally fictional story guys talking about this invasion, how it was proceeding, whipping the public into war hysteria before the war even started. So yes, there's a lot to talk about with regards to this, but it keeps circling back around certain key figures. And one of the key figures in the World War I conspiracy was someone who was actually dead at the time that World War I finally transpired, but it wasn't for lack of his work to make that happen. And I'm talking about King Edward VII, the eminence gris, the power behind the throne. He was the power on the throne, which was unusual at the time because the royal family was increasingly at a distance from foreign affairs, and no, we don't dictate anything. But King Edward VII very much did. He was very much hands-on with his diplomacy, and he had someone in the Foreign Office working for him, doing his dirty work, who was closely connected to his family, i.e. Sir Edward Grey, who is another name that should definitely resonate with viewers of the World War I conspiracy and people who did their homework on that. So, once you start to dive into it, you start to see this hidden influence that certainly there was a royal influence towards the steering of the British public towards war, but more importantly, perhaps, the setting, the machination of the gigantic diplomatic machinery that did make World War I inevitable. And yes, King Edward VII died in 1910, but the trap that he had laid was sprung in 1914, and it worked like clockwork. And that is very much part of the point of the World War I conspiracy, which was a decades-long conspiracy that ended up at that fracture point in history in 1914. And there are various things that you can do to psychologize King Edward VII and why he was so interested in promoting this anti-German agenda, one of which may have been an alignment of vision with someone like a Cecil Rhodes, also dead by the time of World War I, long dead, but who had started that secret society from which Milner's Kindergarten and all of those conspirators came from, that was carrying on that idea of, we're going to essentially bring the British Empire to the world. It's going to be a British Empire world by the time we're done. By the forwarding of our secret society, well, one could imagine that the King of England would be on board with such a vision, but also, just from a familial perspective, again, just because there are Germanic names or titles in your family's history does not mean that you are necessarily pro-German per se, and perhaps more of an influence on Edward VII was his wife, who was Danish, and who happened to have come from a family that was involved personally in a battle with the Prussians back in the mid-19th century, in which Denmark had lost some of its territory and hated the Germans for the rest of her life. Very much, I think, some of that spirit might have been at play in the machinations of King Edward. Anyway, there's a lot to get into here, and one source that I would recommend for that, excuse me, is a source that, again, you will recognize if you've watched the World War I conspiracy and followed those links. Specifically, Peter Hoff, who wrote a book that I referenced in the World War I conspiracy, The Two Edwards, How King Edward VII and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey Fomented the First World War. This is an incredibly important part of the World War I story and how the machinations for World War I were laid years in advance by really stunning acts of diplomatic chicanery that really had very little parallel in history. I'm referring, of course, to the formation of the Triple Entente between Britain and France and Russia in the first decade of the 20th century, which was something that was completely unthinkable, unimaginable even a few years before, but which was pulled off essentially by the machinations, charisma, and hard work of King Edward VII. Now, this is something that Peter Hoff writes about in his book on the Two Edwards, and it is something that I talked to him about when I was recording my interview with him for the World War I conspiracy. You can see parts of that interview in the World War I conspiracy, but I never released the entire interview. Well, I'm going to play for you a special look into that interview. Here is several minutes of my conversation with Peter Hoff about King Edward and Sir Edward Grey and their manipulations and machinations for fomenting World War I that did not make it into the documentary. And I start by talking about that Triple Entente that formed at the beginning of the 20th century. Let's talk about the formation of that Triple Entente, the French, Russian, British military alliance that, of course, encircled Germany physically, geopolitically, but also, of course, in the military sense. That, from our perspective today, perhaps it doesn't sound so amazing, but in that first decade of the 20th century, for England and Russia and France, historical enemies and rivals, to come together in a type of Triple Entente was quite an incredible diplomatic coup. How was that diplomatic coup pulled off?
It was totally a diplomatic coup. It was the King Edward VII visited France in May of 1903, and he did what nobody had believed possible. He was greeted in Paris by boos and catcalls, and when he left 3 days later, they were calling him our king, notre roi. And he changed an attitude of France in 3 days. It was a miracle. German statesmen did not think that it was possible. But it did happen in 3 days, and the King Edward VII laid the groundwork for the Anglo-French the Entente Cordiale, and this eventually became the Triple Entente.
Let's talk about King Edward VII, who was a colorful character in many different ways. Tell us a little bit about his background and who he was.
Well, he was the eldest son of Queen Victoria, and he was kind of normal when he was born, and his first education. He pretty soon showed a very much of a predilection for the company of women, which was an embarrassment to his parents, but he early on he developed an anti-German attitude by his visits to France, and France very soon became to appreciate that he had this attitude, this anti-German attitude, and he made connections with people in France. Most often. This guy, his name escapes me right now, but it became known in French circles that the king, the future king, was definitely anti-German, and that they could make use of that attitude, and they did do that, in fact.
And let's talk about the foreign secretary at that time, as this Triple Entente was coming together, Edward Grey. What was his role in this formation of this alliance?
Well, he became a foreign secretary in 1905, I believe, and the foreign secretary in France was, of course, Delcasse. And Delcasse was very much anti-German and very passionate about the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine. And so he and the king hit it off very well together. And Edward Grey shared this anti-German feeling with the king, as I explained in my book, how he came to have that attitude about Germany. But in any case, he had the same attitude with the king. They worked very well together. And Edward Grey very freely acknowledged the heavy role that the king played in British foreign policy, and he said that this was not a problem because he and the king were in an agreement on most issues, and so they worked very well together.
Let's talk about that, because that may not, again, strike us from our perspective as so unusual. Perhaps that was the way politics worked at that time, but it wasn't the way politics generally worked at that time. The king to be an active part of the setting of the foreign policy and diplomatic relations of the country, rather than the parliament, is not necessarily, in fact, did breach a lot of protocol. So talk about that the way that King Edward VII upended a lot of people's opinions about what the royal position should be in setting foreign policy for Britain.
It's very true. People who address this issue of the king formation, the king's role in the formation of Triple Entente, they say that did not happen because the king was a constitutional monarch and he did not have the power to make these decisions. But of course, this is true. It's true only in the most technical sense. In fact, when the king went on, he traveled a lot, and when he came aboard his ship, there was a transformation. I mean, he became Henry VIII in effect. He made deals with all kinds of leaders to whom, in many cases, he was related, and he was thousands of miles away from people who might remind him that he was overstepping his constitutional authority. He did not have to deal with these people, and he made deals right and left, and in concert with Sir Edward Grey, and nobody challenged him.
All right, once again, that is Peter Hoff, author of The Two Edwards, How King Edward VII and Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey Fomented the First World War, with some information that I think helps supplement that picture that is being painted in the World War I conspiracy. So as always, I will ask you to refresh your memory about the World War I conspiracy if it's been a while since you have imbibed that documentary. There's a lot of, I think, important information in there. But if you want to continue filling out this picture and find out more about King Edward VII's particular role in setting up what became World War I, well, I'll direct you to, this source, King Edward VII evil demiurge of the Triple Entente and World War I, which is from EIR. And I know the more switched on people in the crowd will go, oh, Executive Intelligence Review? Yes, friends. Well, it's one of those things. When you start looking at anything that's critical or questioning of psychology, you are going to start running into Scientology-linked sources. And when you start looking into anything that is critical of the British royal family, you are going to start looking into LaRouche sources. Because, as you'll know if you've heard anything from the LaRouches, every conspiracy in the world goes back to the British royals. And if you go back far enough in time, the Venetians. I always like trying to play that drinking game when you're listening to a LaRouche. Every time they mention the British royal family, 1 shot. Every time they mention the Venetians, 2 shots. You'll be dead within a couple of minutes, guaranteed. I'd like to lock the LaRouches. It's all the British royals and the Venetians in a room with the people who are, it's all the Jews. They're behind every conspiracy, and lock them in with... it's all the Vatican. It's all the Jesuits. And lock them all in a room together and let them debate each other for the rest of their natural lives. Meanwhile, at the adult table, we can continue the conversation. Anyway, yes, broken clocks are right twice a day, and it must be time to criticize the British royal family. So here we are at EIR, and this King Edward VII, evil demiurge of the Triple Entente in World War I, is an extensive and well-researched article. There's a lot of information about King Edward VII and his machinations there pre-World War I, including, of course, his ties to Queen Victoria, also known as Mrs. John Brown, and, of course, Edward the Caresser and his infamous exploits, but also the House of Jack the Ripper. That's worth looking into, talking about the King Edward's connections to the Churchill family and the Chamberlains and Sir Edward Grey and even Théophile de Classé, etc. Alexander Izvolsky, Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting connections and things to really tie the bow on this and see how King Edward VII was personally involved in the World War I conspiracy. And you know what? You can even expand it out from there. I'll throw in, why not? It's that broken clock time of day. So EIR, November 97, they had a extensive, what was ostensibly a book review, but there's a lot of information in here on the immorality of the House of Windsor, which goes into some of their post-World War I kerfuffles and machinations, and definitely worth looking into. Having said all of that, I think I am more on the Docherty and McGregor side of this than on, say, the Hoffer EIR side, that it was all King Edward and Sir Edward Grey acting on behalf of King Edward, or in the spirit of King Edward, that created the World War I conspiracy. I don't think so. I think Edward was clearly an active conspirator, but I think there was, as Docherty and McGregor refer to it, the secret elite who were able to manipulate and use various forces and call upon various resources in the formation of this World War I conspiracy. So I think there's something grander at play. But clearly, I think the British royal family was involved in that. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that this does go beyond simply assigning a nationality to a royal family and deciding that the British royal family is really German and therefore would never... Why would they attack the Germans? That's not quite how this works. Yes, there are some family dynamics at work, as I mentioned. For example, King Edward VII's wife, being virulently anti-German her entire life, hated Wilhelm and the other Germans in the family, and those types of familiar relations, the fact that Wilhelm was not a particularly likable character, and not many people did really enjoy his company at the best of times, probably contributed to that family dynamic. But beyond that, there was clearly the question of empire, and King Edward VII was definitely one of the people who was conspiring to preserve and forward some vision of the British Empire. And, well, anyway, I suppose one way you could look at World War I, if not as a family fight between royals, although there was that aspect to it. Literally, George and Nicholas and Wilhelm were literally cousins, growing up together, spending time in each other's households in various permutations and combinations over the years, marrying into each other's families in various ways. So there was definitely some mixed blood there. But even beyond that, if you looked at World War I from a royal point of view, think about the drastic change in world history that happened in World War I. As I said, in the World War I conspiracy, World War I was a fracture point in history and a clear breaking of an historical line and narrative that had been functioning for at least some centuries before that point. World War I was clearly, we are living in the crater hole of World War I. And one way to think about that is in terms of royal families and their predominance in Europe, at any rate. Pre-World War I, you have Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany. You have Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. You have Charles I in Austria-Hungary. You even have Said Halim Pasha in the Ottoman Empire. You have Prince Wilhelm in Albania. Post-World War I, Wilhelm abdicates, as Openlands indicated there, abdicates the throne, and the Weimar Republic comes along to displace the old German monarchy. The Romanovs, of course, famously slaughtered in the Russian Revolution, and the Bolsheviks ultimately taking control in the USSR. You have the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. A pretty major fracture point in history. The Ottoman Empire dissolved. And Albania? Let me check my notes. A short-lived principality, and then boom, republic. So, yeah, some pretty remarkable changes. And even the rump royalties that you have left over after World War I mean, there's still, yes, a constitutional monarchy in the Netherlands and in Spain, etc., but doesn't amount to much. In fact, probably still in the popular public imagination, and there may be some Anglophile bias here. So, I mean, I suppose there is some just English speakers are more likely to hear about the English royal family. But I think even beyond that, I think in the general broader public imagination, the English royal family is still the Windsors, as they are now known, are still probably the predominant of the British, of the European royalty, I should say. And again, because so much of the European royalty really did spring from Queen Victoria's loins. Don't think about that too long. All right. So there's a lot to say on this and a lot to get into. And so if you did go through the World War I conspiracy, but you did not do your homework and did not read through some of these sources, did not read hidden history, did not get into the deep research of this, well, here's your chance. It is a fascinating and incredibly important story that still has resonant impacts on the world to this very day. So, beyond the World War I conspiracy, and of course, again, CorbettReport.com/WWI, all of the resources, the transcript, all of the links are there for free, as always. But I will also direct you to the World War I Q&A I did for Questions for Corbett number 42, in which I provided a complete reading list for people who wanted to delve more into World War I. And there's lots and lots of different books here, some of which are highly recommended, some not so much. But again, you can listen to me talk about those books and what information I gleaned from them there. And that could be a good starting point to broaden this larger picture that we're painting here. But, long story short, yes, I think World War I, to a certain extent, was a type of it was a plan that was clearly formulated by conspirators, one of which was King Edward VII, and that was in service to a broader aim that was part of a secret cabal that in some ways originated with Rhodes and the Round Table and all of that. But that Round Table morphed throughout the 20th century, not only after the death of Rhodes, but continued to morph into various permutations and began to take a very different shape in the largely post-monarchical, post-World War I world, and things began to change as we headed into the later decades of the 20th century. But that's a story for another day. We will get back to that. Having said all of that, maybe I'll just leave you with this little moment of zen to tie a bow on this, because we started with the very Germanic English royal family. Well, how about the German royal family? How German were they? Well, let's take this from an interesting 1921 reference called The Ex-Kaiser in Exile, talking about the abdication of King Wilhelm and what happened to him. A very early source on that, interestingly. Talking about as King Wilhelm is escaping Germany and heading to exile in the Netherlands. Specifically, he arrives at Amerongen Castle. I won't try to give the Dutch pronunciation because I can't. Amerongen, whatever. Anyway, this is an interesting little moment that's captured in this book. We're talking about this. During the drive through the rain to Amerongen, the Kaiser spoke very little. A very few conventional remarks were all that passed. No doubt he was still stunned by the sudden catastrophe to his house, fatigued by the journey, and anxious to reach a haven. At last, in the failing light, the car drew up at the castle, and as he crossed the bridge over the inner moat to the main door, relief, obvious and deep, at the successful end of his journey from the bewildering transformation scene at Spa to the restful quietude at Amarangan, found expression in a way that would have sounded very unlikely to British ears. "Now," he said to Count Goddard, rubbing his hands together, "give me a cup of real good English tea." Count Goddard smilingly assured him he would get it. Yes, Kaiser Wilhelm's very first request for his host upon reaching his exile in the Netherlands was for a real good cup of English tea. Well, anyway. Well, there you go. And there is a lot more to explore, so I will invite you to look into the show notes, the extensive show notes that will accompany this edition of Questions for Corbett. Thank you, as always, for sending in your questions and for continuing to stay tuned to the Corbett Report. On that note, I'm going to be back doing this again very soon. I hope to talk to you then. Take care.